Okay, so let's talk briefly about movement. But before I do so, several more concepts that I want to clarify. All units that can move have this standard movement allowance of 9 during their movement phase, and they have 5 movement point allowances during their what's called the counter movement phase. It's great. You don't have to print movement points on counters. Everyone has a 9 during their movement phase, or 5 during what's called the counter movement phase, which I'll talk about in a moment. Really easy to remember, just 9. Pretty straightforward. Any unit that can move 9 movement points. Now the stacking rules are fairly generous. During, at the end of the movement phase, you are allowed 3.5 division equivalents per hex. And that's quite a lot. It's a lot of stacking in one hex to really reach that limit. When attacking or defending, the limit to the number of units that can attack out of a hex or contribute to the defense of a hex is limited based on terrain. Now in non-mountainous terrain, that limit is 2.25 division equivalents with a maximum of 2 asset units and a maximum of 1 artillery unit. But in mountainous terrain, this is reduced to 1.25 division equivalents, and again with 2 assets and no artillery units in the mountains. Now, pretty standard movement rules, as in some other war games. You expend movement points as you move from hex to hex and as you cross certain hex sides. Formations or forces can move as a stack. You can drop off units along the way, but once you drop off a unit, that unit cannot move any further. Cavalry can move as well, but there are certain counters, cavalry reaction MPs expended markers, which may reduce cavalry movement point allowances. Now, the terrain effects chart summarizes the cost of moving into different types of terrain. In addition to that, you also pay to cross mountain contours. So for example, if you're moving from a low mountain into a high mountain and you're crossing a mountain contour, you pay +1 movement point for each contour you cross. You pay that cost even if you're following a road across a mountain contour. Now, a key element of this campaign of the Austro-Hungarians' invasion to Serbia was the river system, particularly the Danau and the Sava River. The Danau River is impassable, except for Austro-Hungarian units using pontoons, ferries, or the bridge at Peter Vodane. And Serbian units can never cross the Danau. The Sava River is still quite restricted, but a little easier. You cannot cross this unless you're using a bridge, ferry, or pontoon, or if you began the movement phase adjacent to the river and you're crossing the river. So you have to begin adjacent to the Sava to cross the Sava, unless you're using that bridge, ferry, or pontoon. Furthermore, if you cross the Sava without a bridge or pontoon by starting on one side and then crossing, you place a bridge crossing marker and suffer a temporary strength reduction in attack and defense, and you suffer a temporary artillery value reduction as well. Now, enemy zones of control also affect movement. You pay an extra 2 movement points to enter a hex in an enemy zone of control. You pay an extra 1 movement point to exit a hex in an enemy zone of control. And that's in addition to any other terrain costs, and friendly units do not negate that. That's a constant cost. You can move from enemy zone of control to enemy zone of control, and it costs an extra 6 movement points to do so. Now, unless that hex is already occupied by a friendly formation, in which case it only costs you 4 extra movement points. So if you're moving from one hex enemy zone of control to another hex enemy zone of control, +6. If the hex you're moving to is friendly occupied, it is just +4. That's of course in addition to the normal terrain costs, and in some cases that will make it prohibitive. I mentioned roads earlier. When you're moving along a road, you just pay the cost of the road, you don't pay the cost of the terrain. But of course, as I said, you still have to pay mountain contour crossings. It's the +1 that I mentioned earlier. So, okay, now I mentioned earlier, forced marches can affect your combat effectiveness. Basically, during a movement, you can, at any point in a unit's movement, you can declare that you want to seek another couple of movement points. Now, infantry units can gain an additional 3 movement points. Cavalry units can gain an additional 7 movement points. Now, I haven't mentioned it yet, but units can use movement points to perform what are known as tasks, activities. You cannot use those forced march movement points to conduct tasks. They have to be used for movement, and they have to be the last 3 movement points or last 7 movement points that you use. So you have to use up your base of 9 and then use the extra. And again, they can't be used on tasks. Now, after you've conducted the forced march, after you use up to 3 movement points, you have to conduct an effectiveness check. Basically consists of rolling those 2 dice and modifying the die roll by +1 for each extra movement point you expended during that forced march. So if you only used 1 extra movement point in a forced march, you used 10 movement points in total, you only add +1 to that die roll. If you used all 3, or if you're a cavalry unit using 7, you'd add 7 to that die roll. Now, if you pass, that's fine, nothing happens. If you fail, there is a failure table that you can consult, and there are consequences to that, which can include combat effectiveness level reductions or strength reductions, among others. Now, I'll cover the combat rules in the next video, but because prepared attacks happen during the movement phase, I'll cover them briefly here. Basically, during the movement phase, you can spend some of your movement points for a unit to place a prepared attack marker. And the number of movement points that you spend to place this marker is equal to the cost of moving into the hex that you're attacking. And again, you don't consider roadways in this. So when you're attacking, you're not using roadways to attack a hex. You pay the cost of moving as though the roadway wasn't there. And in doing so, it has to be a minimum of 4 movement points. So you're playing at least 4 movement points to place this prepared attack marker. And you just point the marker towards where you're attacking. Once you've placed a prepared attack marker, that unit can't move anymore. They'll have that PA marker with the arrow pointing to where they're attacking, and they stay where they are. And of course, those prepared attacks can only take place during normal movement, not during the counter movement phase. You can also have prepared attacks pointing at empty hexes. Effectively, what you're doing is you're preparing to attack this empty hex, and it serves as a warning to your enemy that if they're going to move in there, you will attack them. And just a reminder as well that combat ineffective and demoralized infantry, those with the CI or the D combat effective level markers on them, and 2 hex units cannot place prepared attack markers. Furthermore, terrain has an effect on combat, which I'll cover in the next video, but and effectively it reduces the attacker's strength when attacking into that terrain. If the terrain would reduce the attacker's strength below 1, and you'll know this before you sort of plan your attack, you can't place a prepared attack marker. So these prepared attack markers, they declare your intentions quite openly. It also partly locks the enemy into that hex. As I said, you can attack empty hexes as a warning. You also lock enemy forces into hexes that are currently occupied. A PI marker pointing at a hex occupied by the enemy prevents one enemy force that started the phase in that hex from being able to exit the hex, so it locks it in. Pretty much the only thing that, as I said, it locks in one enemy force. The one thing that, there are several things that enemy force can do whilst locked in. They can spend movement points to finish constructing an improved position. They can finish incorporating marsh replacements, or they can conduct a repulse attempt. And if successful, if that successful repulse removes the PA marker, those other movement restrictions are also removed from that hex. Okay, so those prepared attacks must be carried out during the combat phase. The main benefit is, as I said, they lock the enemy in, restrict what they can do, plus you get a column shift to the right if all attackers attacking that hex have prepared their attack. But I'll discuss that more when I go through the combat phase later. But it's generally beneficial to the attacker, locks the enemy in, gives you a column shift, and in some cases can deter your opponent from moving into hexes that you've targeted. Now I mentioned that those defenders subject to a prepared attack by the enemy can do some things, they're generally locked in, but they can do what's known as a repulse. And during the movement phase, or even during a retreat, the active player can repulse enemy units. So this is a special kind of attack that takes place during the movement phase. The person who's moving, the phasing player, expends, it had to be adjacent to an enemy unit, you expend one movement point, and it's this quick little attack where you're trying to force back your opponent. There are a number of limitations and restrictions on it, so only 2 units in an attacking force can be used in a repulse. You can conduct a repulse immediately before beginning your retreat, halfway through your retreat, or even after entering the final hex of your retreat path. So it can happen at any stage along that retreat movement, or movement more broadly. However, during that retreat, so you can conduct that repulse at any time during that retreat movement, but you can only do one repulse during the course of that movement. You can't do one at the start, one in the middle, one at the end. It is just one throughout the course of that movement. Now, if the off chance you had a multi-force retreat from a battle, you can only designate one force of that multi-force stack to conduct that single repulse attempt. Okay. Now, other restrictions: cavalry cannot repulse during reaction movement. But, as I said, only one repulse per retreat, but different enemy forces can be repulsed multiple times during your movement by different forces of yours. So only one repulse per force during retreat, but whilst you're moving, different forces can target the same enemy if they want. Oh, and of course, combat ineffective and demoralized units cannot conduct repulse. So the way this works is you announce a repulse attempt on an enemy. Both sides add up the combat strengths of their units, determine an odds ratio by dividing the attacker's strength by the defender's. You apply modifiers for terrain and any column shifts as per combat normally. Again, if you look at the next video for how combat works. Now, if the final column is 3-1, 4-1, or 6-1, then the active player rolls 2 dice, modify the result for proficiency rating differences, and again I'll go into more detail on this in the next video. So you modify the roll by the PR difference between the units, find the result on the CRT, and if the result on that CRT includes a black circled retreat result, then the repulse is successful. You ignore the rest of the result, it is just that black circled number. If the final column after all those modifiers is 8-1, the repulse is automatically successful. And that success causes the defender to retreat 2 hexes, and that defending or that retreating force has to make an efficiency check modified by +1. And if it fails that check, it suffers 1 combat effectiveness level reduction by being repulsed. And again, that repulsing force can do that midway through. They can continue to move or to fulfill their retreat obligations. Now, if that success, if the repulse attempt had odds of less than 3-1, or if the result did not have a black circled retreat result, then the repulse was unsuccessful. But if you failed your repulse attempt during movement, you make an unmodified efficiency check. If you fail, you suffer a reduction. You can move no further in that phase, but you can use your remaining, so if you stop where you are, you can use your remaining movement points to place prepared attack markers or improved positions. If you fail a repulse during retreat, you again suffer, or have to make an unmodified efficiency check, and if you fail that, you suffer a combat level reduction. You must still continue with your retreat, If you're unable to retreat, then you suffer the normal consequences for being unable to retreat, which is to suffer 1 combat efficiency level reduction and a strength reduction for each hex you fail to retreat. Now, I suppose in rare cases, you may want to attempt a repulse across the Sava River, and you can do so, but you must begin your movement adjacent to the hex you're repulsing. So you can't move to the Sava River and then attempt to repulse across it. You have to start next to the Sava River to commence that repulse. And if successful, you can move into the hex you vacated and then continue your movement on the far side of the river. Now, during the movement phase, you can also attempt to recover your combat effectiveness. You must remain stationary. You spend 9 movement points without moving, and you increase your combat effectiveness status by 1. So if you're at -2, you go up to -1. Now, if for some reason you don't have enough movement points to complete that combat effectiveness recovery within the 1 turn or the 1 phase, you can place what's called a CEL movement points expanded marker on top of that unit, which counts towards that total of 9. So the following turn you can recommence that recovery and just fulfill the remaining movement points needed to recover that full level. Okay. Another thing you can do during the movement phase is to incorporate what are known as marsh replacements. The Austro-Hungarian player can conduct this task, and these are they're special replacements that have a small M inside a white dot on the right side of their unit counter. Now, to incorporate these marsh replacements, you must, again, these Austro-Hungarian units must expend 9 movement points while stationary. And you basically incorporate those separate marsh units within the larger unit. So if that larger unit has a strength reduction, you remove the strength reduction equal to the strength of the marsh unit, and they're considered to be incorporated within the larger unit. During the movement phase, you can also construct improved positions. These are effectively field fortifications or trenches that are built. You build them one at a time in single hexes. They give you the defenders, defending in an improved position, gets 1 column shift to the left, so it helps them in combat. Now, to build an improved position, it has to be done by infantry units. It can be done in all terrain except mountainous terrain. And that infantry unit has to spend a total of 13 movement points. Now, of course, this will have to be done over a series of turns, and you use those movement points expended markers to tally the running total of these movement points. You just place them on top of the unit to show how much you've spent, and then carry that over to the next phase. Once you've spent those 13 movement points, you place the improved position. Now, there are proximity rules to this as well. You can't begin constructing an IP if you are more than 4 hexes from an enemy. So there has to be kind of a threat here. You can't just do it off in the hills somewhere. You have to be 4 or less hexes from an enemy unit. Demoralized units can't construct IPs. And of course, there's a turn limit to the number of IPs, which is shown on the interface chart. Basically, it stops you entrenching all over the place. This is not doctrine at the time, so there are limits to the number of these you can do. Now, once placed, this improved position marker remains in the hex until the end of a phase in which there are no friendly combat units in the hex. So if they move out, the marker is removed from play. And that's about it for IPs. Now, these are constructing an IP, taking these marsh replacements and recovering CEs are known as tasks. That can take some time. You're building up these MPs over possibly several turns. Once you've started working on those tasks, like recovering your CE or constructing an IP or taking on these replacements, you have to finish the task. You cannot voluntarily stop doing whatever it is you're doing. However, in some cases, your task will be interrupted by the presence of the enemy. So you remove these MP expended markers and you'll stop doing the task when an enemy unit comes adjacent to you. That will stop your CE recovery. Or if an enemy unit attacks the hex, you'll stop constructing the IP or stop taking on those marsh replacements. And there are two final things I want to mention for movement. So movement restrictions, so cavalry and core trains units can only enter or exit foothills, low mountain and high mountain terrain via a roadway. They can't just move through this terrain freely. And finally, supply depots have a little R on their counters, and those depot units can only move along friendly operational railway lines. Each railway line costs 1 hex, and just like any other moving unit, they have that 9 movement point allowance during their movement phase and 5 during the counter movement phase. And they can move along both types, single track and narrow track railways. Okay, so that's about it for movement. So I've covered the bases of formations, of forces, of assets, of how these all work together. I've mentioned the importance of supply, but I haven't gone through supply yet. I'll do that in a later video. I will cover combat, retreats, supply, and possibly reinforcements in the next video.